So Prashanta, allow me to introduce yourself. I think we can get started. Meanwhile, while some of them can still join while you kind of take the presentation.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So again, thanks for your time, all, and a special thanks to Prashanta who has agreed to host this session for us. I'll
Mhm.
kind of spend a couple of minutes to introduce Prashanta to you all. Prashanta is a PhD candidate with the Department of Information Systems in the School of Computing at National University of Singapore. His research interests lie broadly in the area of computational social science, where he leverages statistical and computational approaches for studying causality related questions about human behavior on the internet, and particularly in the social networks. Prashanta's research is largely interdisciplinary, has been presented at the leading computer science information systems and marketing conferences worldwide. He holds master's and undergraduate degree in the software systems and computer science respectively, and has worked with teams at the eBay Center of Excellence India, Microsoft Research India, Rakuten Institute of Technology on Consumer Behavior Lab, Singapore. Over to you, Prashanta.
All right. Great. Thanks, Neeraj, for the introduction. And this is actually my second talk with the Teach Edison team. And at the very outset, let me just thank everyone back at Teach Edison for this wonderful opportunity. I think it's an amazing thing what you guys are doing, and also thanks to all the people who have tuned in tonight for this session. I know you probably had a long day, and you must have plenty other options on how to spend a perfectly pleasant evening. But thanks for joining in for this. So I'm a computational social scientist by profession, and a lot of my research lies in the area of social networks and social network analytics. And so today I was hoping that maybe we could have a discussion about what it means to analyze social networks and about the associated issues surrounding visualization. And I'm hoping to also show you one of my favorite tools called Gephi. It's an open source tool, and give you sort of a basic introduction, a kind of a primer into how to visualize small, mid-scale to large-scale networks. All right. Before I get into that, I want to give you some introduction about social networks for those of you who are not very familiar. So you can think of this as a Networks 101 course for those of you who are interested in the preliminaries. So most complex systems that you see in society today have several components. So this is again taking a very reductionist view of society, that if you think about any complex system around you, be it societies, be it countries, be it football teams, these have several components, can be broken into smaller parts. So as an example, you can think of society being comprised of individuals. So each individual can be represented as a node. So again, this is a very graphical way of illustrating what a network is. And so you could have relationships among these nodes, which are represented as edges. So it's again it's a two-dimensional figure. So you have nodes and you have edges. And then these edges could mean different things to different people, right? So a relationship could be about friendship. So you can think about your Facebook network, for example. So if you have 1,000 friends, so then each person on Facebook is a node, and then you have a link between them that becomes a friendship network. It could be kinship. So think about it could be about brothers, sisters, etc. It could be a co-author. So if you're in academia, you're writing a lot of papers, then we could construct these networks where each node is an individual author. And then if two authors have co-authored a paper, you can have a link between them. So that's how you construct a co-authorship network. It could also be romantic relationships. In fact, a lot of the early work in social networks with small networks actually focused on romantic relationships that developed in schools and colleges, and a lot of classic studies on how romantic relationships evolve over time. Actually, now since I'm on this slide, it might be worth mentioning that this is actually a recent paper by folks at Facebook who've used social network data to come up with a model that predicts how relationships form and how they eventually break up over time. So using your Facebook data, they were able to actually construct this very nice map. So Facebook knows when you're going to hook up with someone, and Facebook knows when you're going to break up. It's a very scary thought. So exactly. So again, I'm going to pile on this point that network data is very useful. And as a scientist, you would find network data to be particularly useful if you want to explain something. So think about two nodes in the network, maybe Alice and Bob. And if you want to ask an explanatory kind of a question, so for example, if you're interested in knowing how or why did Alice befriend Bob on the network, that's an explanation, right? That's an explanatory question. Alternatively, you could be interested about prediction, right? So asking questions such as, who will Alice befriend next? And my argument here is that if you have a good sense of the network and you have a good handle on the network data, you can answer both these questions to varying degrees of accuracy. And we'll be talking a bit more about how in the coming slides. Now, networks and the study of social networks actually is pretty old. It's a lot of you might think that since the advent of Facebook, MySpace, all the social network sites, this stream of research has gained a lot of traction. But I would argue that a systematic study of social networks has always been around, right from the early 19th century, and perhaps even earlier. So one of the earliest empirical studies, systematic studies on social networks was actually done not on humans, but on bumblebees by a gentleman called Pierre Huber. So he was a Swiss naturalist, he was a biologist, lived back in the early 19th century, and his father was a naturalist as well. So together, the two of them, they studied bumblebees. It's a special species of bees. And in particular, Pierre Huber wrote a thesis about the anatomy and the whole life cycle of bees. And there was one section in that thesis about what he liked to call the dominant structure of bees. All right, so let me just pause here for a moment. I guess okay, all right, we're good. So there's something called the dominant structure of bees. About who, if you know how bees work, so they live in a society and each person in the society has a specific role. And so if you're a queen bee, you dominate over everyone else. And then among the males, if you're entrusted with reproductive functions, then you have a higher prestige or higher social status than the other male bees who just have to work. So there's this kind of a dominant structure, and that was the first ever systematic study of how kind of these networks exist in different organisms. Now, fast forward a couple of centuries to 2015, and well, this is actually my own Facebook network. So I crawled the data from Facebook and plotted it, and this was from 2013. And I just wanted to see how my social network online looked like. And you can easily see that there are these 2 or 3 major clusters, which very high density among the nodes. And then you have a couple of these smaller clusters, on the top left. And so each of these clusters, if you know a bit about my previous history, actually correspond to institutions that I've attended in my academic career. So there's one for my school, one for my friends from undergraduate college. There's one over there for my friends from my master's university, where I just spent 1.5 years. So there are not too many people over there. So you see how the kind of a systematic study of social networks spans easily 2 to 3 centuries. So we're actually doing something that's very modern, very contemporary, but also very historical at the same time. Again, for fun fact, the median Facebook user has 200 friends. The mean number of friends that any person has on Facebook is roughly around 338. However, for bees, going back to the topic of bumblebees, the number of bees exist in colonies, and in each colony there are anywhere in the order of 50 to 400 bees in one single colony, which is why on the right hand side you would call Facebook a social network. We call bees to be what's called an EU social network. And EU social networks, for those of you who have a little bit of interest in in biology would know that eusociality is actually a highest form of social behavior, where you not just take care about yourself and your friends, but you also take care about people completely unrelated to you. So it's a perfect system of a cooperative society. So even though bees are structurally or anatomically much simpler organisms than humans, when it comes to social networks, they actually have very complicated and very mature social networks, which are essential for their survival. So networks exist everywhere, right? I give you an example of bees. I give you an example of Facebook. If you go to a classroom in a school, who you decide to sit next to, these are all decided by networks, okay? And while that's interesting, I think a lot of you might be wondering, why should I care? You know, if you're in the industry, if you have a day job, if you're in academia, you're researching something, why is it of interest to you? And so my argument here is that thinking about a phenomena in a network perspective often reveals new information or applications. And I'm going to talk a bit about how that's possible. So ever since I started researching networks, whatever I look at in terms of a phenomena, I always look at it from a lens of a network, and I'm trying to understand how does network have a play here. Let me give you some examples. So you could think of a network of network researchers. So I actually took this graph, and I understand this might be a little hard to read for a couple of you, but I just give you an overview of what this means. This is actually a network of social network researchers over time in history. And as you can see, there are these two major clusters, right? And so even if you're a completely lay person, you have no idea about the history of sociology, you can easily make out, just by looking at this figure, that there seems to be these two major clusters. And you obviously have to ask yourself, why do these clusters form, right? And again, if you knew a little bit about the history of sociology and you looked at the names in these clusters, you would be able to realize that the cluster on the left is almost entirely composed of researchers who are sociologists by nature. And the cluster to the right, they are mostly mathematicians or doing what's called mathematical sociology. They're mostly math people. And then you have these two nodes who sort of serve as bridges in the middle, right? So those two individuals, again, if you're familiar with the history of social networks, you'd be familiar with these names. This one person, one among these two, is a very famous researcher called James Coleman. He's one of the most cited sociologists. And the other is Carl Deutsch, who's a political scientist and sociologist. And the reason these two people are very important is very clear just by looking at this figure, right? So these are individuals who serve as bridges between two very distinct fields, sociology and mathematics. So even though you have no idea about either of those fields, just by looking at a network diagram of network researchers, you're able to derive certain insights very easily, very quickly. And I think that's, again, a very beautiful thing about network analysis. All right, let me give you another example. So this is a citation network. So here, each node is actually a journal. And if there is an arrow between two nodes, it means that this journal cites papers from the other journal, okay? And the first figure to the left is for a period between 1985 to 1991. And the figure to the right is for a period between 1995 to 2001. And you can see that the citation structure significantly changes across decades. Again, so it gives you an insight into how fields change. So on the left-hand side, you'd see a lot of finance and marketing journals citing other journals. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see a lot of information systems journal in turn citing these finance and marketing journals. You see how power structures change in academia just by looking at these figures. All right, so I think I'm going to pause here for a second. If you have any questions, I think I have something on the chat. All right, so Mukund asks, what would you say is the fundamental objective of network analysis? All right, so again, if you think about what I mentioned a couple of slides back, I think of it in two ways. Well, one is, of course, about explanation. Can you understand fundamental insights about a field by looking at these different networks? So I just give you an example that's on the current slide. So you're looking at citations across a decade between important journals. And by just looking at how this network changes, you're able to derive very fundamental insights about how academia works. So that's the explanatory side of it. You could also think about the predictive value of network analysis. So for example, now, if I know the network, citation network till 2001, can I predict what the citation network will look like in 2020? And that holds a lot of value for young scholars, right? Because you want to know where your field is headed. So I think there's definitely a lot of predictive value as well as explanatory value to doing network analysis. All right, so does that answer your question? Okay, so cool. All right, so are there any questions at this point, or can we just move on? Actually, I have a few more examples. Okay, there's one more. Okay, perfect. Okay, this is my favorite slide, actually. There was a very famous study called the super entity study, where they studied how organizations were connected to each other in terms of owning shares, owning stocks. Okay, so they did it. So this plot is about different firms linked to each other, where each edge denotes whether the firm has some investment in the other firm in terms of shares. So they actually analyzed 37 million publicly traded companies across the world. Now, among those 37 million companies, they specifically looked at 43,000 companies that owned shares in other companies. Okay. Among those 43,000 companies, they focused down or narrowed down on 1,318 companies which owned shares in more than two companies. Okay, but these are people who have sort of a portfolio, so they own sort of controlling or non-controlling stock options in multiple companies. And then within those 1,318 companies, they finally could manage to find these 147 companies who basically owned each other's shares. And they accounted for 40% of the entire corporate wealth in the whole world. So you might have heard about this saying called too large, too big to fail. So they're talking about these 147 companies. So if you can see the figure on the right, these are mostly companies in the finance sector. So they basically own each other's shares. And you know that, this is a very striking finding, because a very clear implication of this is if any one of these companies go down, there would be a domino effect on all the other companies, and that sort of might collapse the whole economy. And that's how entire recessions get started. Okay, so this is another very good example of how network analysis can uncover critical limitations in the economy, actually. All right, and this is just another good example of application of social network analysis, biological networks. So on the left-hand side, you see an example of the brain and the neural network inside brains. And I mentioned it's the real one, not the artificial neural networks. It's actual the structure of neurons inside your brain. And the study of this is sometimes called connectomics. And on the right-hand side, you have the protein-protein interaction networks at a cellular level. And this is sometimes called interactomics. And while both these exist in your body at different parts, they actually come together for a common application quite often. So if you take an application like Alzheimer's, a very common disease, if you think about what causes causes this particular disorder, you'd have to focus on the docking, the protein-protein docking interactions. But if you think about how to diagnose this, how to test for Alzheimer's, you actually look at the neural structures in your brain. So both of these biological networks actually come together in understanding how Alzheimer occurs and how it can be detected in the human body. All right, so let me pause here for a second and see if you have any questions on network analysis or just the different examples that we spoke about briefly. All right, okay. So if there are no questions, let me move ahead. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about basic network properties. So every network comprises of actors, which are nodes, vertices, and points, and also relations, which are basically edges. Also called arcs, lines, ties, depending on which field you're actually studying in. So relations could be directed or undirected, and binary and value. Okay. All right. So this is an example of an undirected network where the individual ties are binary in nature. Okay. Wait, I'm just going to pause here. Are you able to see the screen at the moment, or it did disappear?
We can see Prashanta. Yeah.
Okay. There's just a gray screen blob. It is blurred by a black box. Okay. Okay. All right, but are you guys able to see the text and the other parts of the content?
Maybe Prashanta, what you can do is you can just stop sharing for a second and then try to share again.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
That might solve the problem. Yeah.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah, yeah, this is clear. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys. All right. Okay, so we're talking about these different kinds of networks. So networks could be undirected, so where you don't have a direction from one node to another. So think about kinships, right? So if you're connected to your brother and sister, it's just a connection. There is no sense of direction, right? But then if you think of a Facebook friend, so you send a friend request and then the other person has to accept or reject. That's a directed network, right? Because you're the one sending a request and the other person is accepting one. And so it could be a binary network where the edges are 1 or 0. So you're either a friend or not a friend, okay? Or it could also be weighted networks or what's called a valued network. So again, you could think about the strength of a friendship. That you might be closer friends with some people and then not so close with some others. So you can probably assign a weight on the friendship. So if you want to model it that way, then you could think about valued or weighted networks. So there are different ways of representing networks. But then, how would you store networks in any program or in your coding? What kind of data structures can you use to represent networks? So the easiest way to do it is through what's called adjacency matrices. So again, if you're familiar with a little bit of linear algebra, this is a very simple square matrix. And if you compare the matrix to the network diagram on the top, you'd see that a cell has a value 1 if a tie exists between the two nodes. So if you take the first row here, you'd see that there is no tie between A and A, so there's no loop, so there's no value in the cell, but there is a tie between A and B, which is why you have a 1 here. So for the other one, you could see that you have the corresponding adjacency matrix. So that's how you construct a matrix. If there's a tie, you put 1. If there's no tie, you put 0, or you just keep it blank. So the other way to store a network is through lists. So once you have an adjacency matrix, what you could do is you could convert it to what's called an adjacency list. So it's a very simple idea. So you take the first row, A, and you just list out all the nodes that A is connected to. Okay, so it's in the first row it's just B, so it's B. B is connected to both A and C. So in the second row you have B and then A and C, kind of like a linked list. And then an edge list is it's very similar to an adjacency list, but in each row you just have one edge. All right. Okay, so I have a couple of. Sorry. All right. So Mukund asks, how do we store weighted relations? Well, you could have weighted adjacency matrices too. So adjacency matrices in this particular case are binary, so you're 1 or 0. But you could also think about assigning specific weights to those cells. Instead of having 1, you could have 5 or 6, etc. So how do we give weight in adjacency matrix? So yeah, exactly. So so instead of having 1, you could assign it any other value, as long as it's a real value. All right. Okay. It has to be a positive integer. Okay. All right. All right. So now that we know how to store a network, we're going to look a little bit about what are the node level characteristics in a network. So these are features. If you think about in a very machine learning perspective, these are node level features. So you can think about individual characteristics, like for example, if your node is an individual, it could be gender, it could be age. If your node is an organization, like in the corporate network, then it could be about the size of your organization. All right. You can also think about network dependent measures. So these are measures that depend on the network but are calculated at a node level. So again, you can think about centrality scores, and I'm going to talk about centrality a little later. So one example of centrality is degree centrality. So what degree centrality means is the number, it's very simply put, it's the number of connections you have. So in a directed network, you can have two different kinds of degree centrality. One's called an out degree. Again, a little bit of math over there. So what this basically means is it's the sum. So A is an adjacency matrix. So it's basically the sum of all your edges, which sort of originate from you, outwardly directed. That's called out degree. In degree is the exact opposite. It's the sum of all edges that end in you, that have your node as a sink. Okay. So let me give you a small example. If you have this, the adjacency matrix that's shown on the slide, so out degree for the third row here, and in degree is the third column. Okay. So if you have to compute out degree, you take the sum of the third row. If you have to compute the in degree, you take the sum of the third column for node C. All right. Is this point clear about how we compute degree centrality? All right. Okay. So we have a question. All right. Perfect. So it's clear. So we can also have other measures of centrality. So degree is probably the most commonly used centrality measure, but you could have other measures like closeness, for example. And closeness is a measure of distance of a node from all other nodes in a network. It's as the name suggests, right? If you take any random node in the network, how far is this node from every other node in the network? Some measure of that. So this is the formula for closeness. The denominator here is this term called Dij, which is basically farness. Dij stands for farness, and D is distance. So it's for all j. So j is every other node in the network. The distance between I and j gives a measure of farness, near versus farness of every other node from the focal node I. If you take the inverse of that, you get closeness. That gives a measure of how close you are to every other node. You can also think about betweenness centrality, and I think this is one of my favorite centrality measures because it's a very cool concept. It actually measures how many shortest paths in the network pass through the focal node. So betweenness of any node I in the network is actually the ratio of the number of shortest paths between S and T that pass through I divided by all possible shortest paths between any two nodes S and T. All right. So this is very clear what betweenness. So if you think about it, I mean, just take a step back from all the math and just think conceptually about what these capture. Betweenness actually captures captures a probability that you act as a bridge between these different clusters in your network. So if you act as a bridge, so remember the network of social network researchers, the example that I gave, and think about Carl Deutsch and James Coleman. They were acting as bridges between the group of sociologists and the group of mathematicians. And so these are people with very high betweenness. Okay. So you could also have eigenvector centrality. Okay. And so eigenvector, okay, we have a question. Let me just quickly pause here. The closest gives us a skew. Well, in a way, I think you could say that, but I mean, over here it captures a very different meaning. Yeah, but I understand why you're asking that question. But yeah, I mean, here in terms of networks, if you just think about closeness as the average of shortest distance from that node to every other node in the network. Some measure of that. Yeah. There are different ways to compute closeness. All right. So eigenvector centrality is so okay. So pause here. This follow-up question. So Mukund asks, so what's the distance defined as? The distance is a number of hops it takes for you to reach from node I to node J. So if you think about, you start from your node and you move 1 hop, 2 hops, 3 hops to another node, then the distance is 3. Okay, all right, great. So another, and I think this is becoming more and more important these days, another centrality measure is eigenvector centrality. And this is interesting because it defines the centrality of the node in terms of the centrality of its neighbors, in terms of how important your neighbors are. So in terms of the math, so it's very simply, it's kind of a recursive, it's not recursive, it's more of a self-referential formula. So the eigenvector centrality of node I is a function of all its neighbors, the eigenvector centrality of all its neighbors. Okay, I have a quick question. All right, clear. But then eigenvector centrality has an inherent problem. So if your eigenvector centrality is a function of the eigenvector centrality of all your neighbors, so your centrality is decided by the centrality of all your neighbors, it creates an inherent problem in networks. Does anyone have a guess what this inherent problem is? It's actually very obvious. Any guesses? Why this is not a very efficient centrality measure? Okay, I'm going to give you the answer. The defined centrality is vague. Okay. Okay, so then what is central? Yeah, so you're all sort of getting at it from different angles. The problem with this is, so if your centrality is, so again, someone asked what's eigenvector centrality. You compute the eigenvectors. If you write the eigenvector equation in terms of the adjacency matrix, so it's AX equal to lambda X, where X is your eigenvector, basically. And A is your adjacency matrix. You solve for that equation to get your eigenvectors. The inherent problem here is that if your centrality is a function of all your friends, then if you have very influential friends, your centrality becomes very high. But then in the next time period, since your centrality is very high, it increases the centrality of all your friends. And so it keeps going back and forth. And as a result, what you have is you have these clusters inside in big networks, which have very high where every node has very high centrality, just because of this reflection problem. The centrality keeps bouncing back and forth between you and your friends. So that's a problem with eigenvector centrality. There have been some refinements of this about cart centrality and etc. I'm not going to talk about that. You read about it on Wikipedia if you're interested on how to rectify this problem. All right. So again, someone mentioned this point on the chat window a couple of minutes back. But so if there's so many different kinds of centrality, how do you decide which one is the most central node? And the answer to this question almost always is it depends. So just give you an example of a network where depending on which metric you decide, you'd come up with a different answer for which is the most central node. Okay. So in this network, J has the highest degree centrality, P has the highest closeness centrality, H has the highest betweenness centrality, and D has the highest eigenvector centrality. So it's completely contextual and depends on what you really want to get at. So for example, if you're interested in understanding partitions in networks, you'd probably be more interested in betweenness. If you're interested in understanding popularity, influentials, you'd probably be more interested in degree. If you're interested in kind of system networks, like how how the speed of diffusion and information flow, then you'd probably be more interested in closeness. So because you want to know how soon I can pass an information to every other node in the network, so you'd be interested in closeness. So it depends completely on the context that you're studying. So far we've discussed node level attributes. Now we have a quick slide that talks about edge level attributes. So as someone mentioned earlier as well, relations don't need to be binary. So they could be weighted. So a weight could be, for example, frequency of calls. So if you're calling multiple people on your phone, the number of times, the number of minutes you talk to a person can be the weight of that link between you two. It could be ranked. So it could be a rank order. So the edges could be ordered based on most frequent callers, second frequent callers, 1, 2, 3, etc. Or it could be different types. So you can have, actually you could even have multi-level networks where two nodes can have two edges where the two edges are of different types. All right. So I can be, so if you think about me and my wife, so we have one network could be personal. And if we write a paper together, we could also be co-authors. So there could be multiple edge types in the same network. All right, so I'm going to take a few minutes, and okay, before I get into that, let me pause here and see if there are any other questions so far on the different kinds of attributes, or basically just any other question that might be floating in your minds at this point. All right, so I have a question here. Yeah. I do like your user ID, Iceman. Okay. What's the best way of storing social network data types? Okay, that's if you're thinking purely in terms of storage space, adjacency matrices might not be the best idea, because then because some of these matrices for large networks tend to be very sparse. So you have a lot of empty spaces. So you'd be wasting a lot of space storing non-information. So a lot of people store large networks in the form of like flat files having just edge lists or adjacency lists. But then if you have more optimized ways of storing sparse matrices, then that's a better way, because a lot of our network packages and functions that we use in tools work best on adjacency matrices, because they're optimized for adjacency matrices. So it'll save you a lot of time in computation later on. So it's kind of a trade-off. So you can either store it as a sparse matrix, but then it saves you time when you're doing different things, or you could store it as a list, but then convert it to a matrix during runtime when you're running different algorithms. So it's kind of a, yeah. All right, so are there any other questions? Okay. Okay, so no other questions. Let me just take a few minutes to talk about something that's more closer to my interests, there's these different research problems, different open areas. If you're interested in social network analysis and want to get into or want to read more about something, here's a nice collection of different areas that you can look at. Okay, so I have one more chat question. Okay. Is there, so Iceman asks, is there a specific software that is better for the calculation than the visualizations? Yeah, so my preferred software is actually iGraph. So you have iGraph packages in R and library in Python. So if you're doing computations or you're running different kinds of algorithms, I definitely recommend iGraph over Gephi. And Gephi is more suitable for doing preliminary analysis, computing these node level attributes, etc., and mainly visualization. Yeah, so it depends on where your interest lies. So for example, if you want to run a shortest path algorithm over on a network that has 100 million nodes, there's no way you can use Gephi. You have to use something that's more optimized for large networks. Something like iGraph would be a better choice. Yeah. I actually have a slide comparing different tools a few slides from now. Okay. All right, so if you're looking at research problems, you could think about empirical studies using network data. So again, I briefly mentioned about this. There are a lot of papers in recent years that use network data to explain different kinds of individual level or firm level behavior. If you're more mathematically oriented, you want to dive into linear algebra, you could read up about graph theory, discrete math, and different kinds of random graph models that are very common in statistics. Or if you're a computer science person, you're basically just a very good programmer, you want to solve some hard computational problems, there are plenty of really nice, juicy algorithmic problems in networks too. So one example, for instance, is network sampling. So if you have a network of 100 million users, how do you do a random sample of 100 individuals from that network? Now, a simple answer to that could be I just randomly pick 100 people from the network. But you can't do that because if you randomly pick 100 people from the network, you destroy the network structure. So how can you do sampling on a large network while preserving the underlying network structure? So that's a computationally hard problem to do. In terms of analysis, you could think about individual level networks. You could do analysis at dyad levels about how friendships. The word dyad means two. It's like pairs. Or you could do network level analysis. So about how entire networks evolve over time, for example. But it's just to give you an overview of different kinds of research problems in this space. Well, there are also some unique challenges to doing network research if you're interested in this area. So very broadly, there are two streams of network studies. The first one looks at structure and evolution. So about our network structure and how networks evolve over time. And then the questions that you are faced with when you're doing analysis in this area is, how do we quantify the structure? So do you only focus on degree? Do you only focus on closeness? What kind of metrics are right in this context? And understanding how did this structure evolve over time. So if you can track a particular network every year, so you think about your friendship network on Facebook, it changes every month, every year. So can you have an algorithm that basically models how the network evolves over time? So that's sort of the first stream. And the second stream is about processes. So if you move away from structure and ask deeper behavioral questions, why do people make friends? How does information spread on the network? How do diseases spread? These questions go beyond the structure and ask how the nodes actually behave in the network. How do edges behave? What's the underlying mechanism? And the big problem, and this is actually where a lot of my own PhD research comes in, I try to understand how these two streams are actually interrelated. You cannot study structure without understanding mechanism, and you cannot study mechanism without understanding structure. One influences the other. Let me give you a simple example. If you're on Facebook, and you're posting a lot of status updates. So I don't know if any of you are friends with me on Facebook. I post a lot every day. And a lot of what I post is actually directly influenced by my own friends on Facebook. So I see what others are posting, and sometimes I share their post, or I get inspired from their post and I write something. So what I produce as content is a direct function of my network, and vice versa. So since I produce a lot of content, that exposes me to a lot of new people who in turn send me friend requests, and I make new friends. So my network also is a function of the content I produce. So you see, there is a interlink, there's the interplay between the structure and processes. And how you separate these two empirically through your studies is actually a pretty hard problem to crack. So one way to do it is if you can do experiments, like randomized experiments. And I actually had a previous talk with Teach Edison that spoke a lot about randomized control experiments. But these are very hard to do in networks. So if you want to do an experiment on a network, for those of you who are familiar with experiments, you have a treatment group and you have a control group. So let me again give you a simple example. If you had a hypothesis, if you're a researcher, you think that maybe the more friends you have on Facebook, the more you post. If that's your hypothesis, how do you test it? Well, you could do an experiment. You could take 10 people who have a lot of friends, and you can have 10 others, and you can make them not have friends. And you can see how different their behaviors are over time. But the point is, can you randomize friendships? That's the problem, right? Can you randomly add or subtract friends on Facebook? You cannot. It becomes very impractical. You cannot force people to have or not have friends. So that's one of the reasons why you cannot do experiments on networks. The ties are already formed. You cannot do anything about it. So which is why you actually have to use a lot of non-experimental methods, statistical models, to try and answer questions about how structure influences process and how process influences structure, things like that. Typically, experiments don't work too well on networks. All right. So are there any questions, or do you want to have any thoughts about research problems in social networks, or anything that strikes you as interesting or boring, or you think that I might have missed, or you want to know a little bit more about? Okay. So if there are no other questions, then okay, there's one question. Any topics done? Okay, there are two. So let me take the first question. Any topics done on scalability for big data? Well, yes. So there's been a lot of work on approximation algorithms in networks. So for instance, recently, Facebook, so I can actually share this paper with you later on. Facebook published a study on the small world algorithm. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the small world algorithm experiment was done decades back by Stanley Milgram, who showed that you can reach any person in this world in a matter of 6 hops. So he did it with actual letters in the US. And Facebook has been trying to replicate that experiment every year to try and see how the online network is becoming closer and closer. And they found out that on Facebook, you can actually, the shortest path between you and any other node on Facebook anywhere is actually less than 4 on average. So the world is actually smaller on Facebook. That's a big claim. Now, to actually implement the small world algorithm at a scale of 1.7 billion nodes requires approximation algorithms. So you have to come up with better ways to approximate distances. And that's, again, a very good example of how scalability research comes into play when you're thinking about big data and social networks. Yeah, I can actually share that paper with you. You might be very interested to read it. Okay, let me take the second question. In your experience, does the social network analysis account for fat tails in distribution? Could you explain a bit more on that? Do you want to unmute the mic? Okay. All right. Let me see. All right. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't admit that.
The endpoints of a distribution, the outliers. Yeah, I understand that. Are you talking about fat tail or long tail? Okay, all right. Okay, your mic's not working. Are you talking about a fat tail or a really long tail? They're two different things. Okay, all right. And so when you say does it account for it, what do you mean? Are you asking any extreme data points in the distribution? Oh yes, yeah, yeah. I'll actually show this when I'm doing the demo, how this happens. Yeah, it does take into account short and long tails. Great. Okay, perfect. Okay, so for the last part of this talk, I'm going to focus a bit more on the visualization aspect of social networks. So of course, a question that I always had ever since I was a kid was, why do we need to visualize? Why do we need to? Because I personally am really bad at drawings and plotting, and I think if I could just know, if I knew how to plot graphs, I would probably have many more publications than what I have right now. So it always fascinated me about what is the intrinsic value of visualizing networks or any other form of data for that matters. So there's actually no standard way of drawing a network, but some forms are more revealing than others. But I think what probably everyone who knows a little bit about visualization will agree that it does support quick exploration. So you can look at a figure, a diagram, and quickly derive some insights without really diving deep into the context. So you remember the first example about social networks that I showed you was about social network researchers. And you might have no idea about the history of sociology and social networks, but just by looking at the network diagram, you get a very good sense of how the field is clustered and who are the key influential people connecting these different clusters, right? So it gives you some quick exploration. So let's talk a bit about Gephi. So Gephi was created in 2008 by Matthew Bastian and his friends, and open source under the GNU the GPL version 3 license. So it introduced as a standalone application, and so it's built on Java. So you need Java installed on your JRE on your computer to actually run it. It comes in Windows, Unix, and Mac versions. So you don't need to have Windows. And it's actually pretty good at scaling. So it works up to 1 million nodes. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think that's necessarily true. You can probably load a network of 1 million nodes, but it will become really clunky afterwards. And it works with almost all known graph formats. So again, this is something that I probably didn't cover in the slides today, but you can store network data on your computer as a edge list. So it could be a CSV and Excel file. It could be GDF, GML, GraphML. Pajek was one of the older tools. UCNet was an older tool. But these are proprietary network data formats. Okay, so you could store network data in any of these formats. So you could create these highly interactive graphs on Gephi. That's probably the strongest point about Gephi. It gives you a very clean interface for creating and visualizing graphs, and it also lets you export these graphs to your own local server or some web server for easy publishing and easy collaborating and sharing. So that on that side is pretty cool. And the Gephi marketplace, and probably this is the coolest aspect about Gephi. You have all these plugins that you can download from the marketplace, and I think right now you have more than 100 plugins easily that augment the core functionalities of Gephi. So Gephi comes with its own bare bones structure with a few functionalities, but if you want to do more advanced stuff in networks, you can download the relevant plugin, and it's just in a matter of clicks, you can do a lot of advanced stuff. And I'm going to actually show you an example of a very cool plugin today. And again, a very important aspect about the big data era is integrating with existing big data sources. So I think Gephi does a pretty good job. You can connect Gephi, import data, network data from not just flat files, but also existing MySQL or NoSQL databases, as well as graph databases like Neo4j and OrientDB, etc. Yeah, so it's actually very well connected in terms of interoperability. Finally, yeah, it supports streaming graphs and dynamic graphs. So streaming data is the thing now, right? If you're doing big data, you know that streaming databases are actually like that. It's the most in thing in analytics, and so it actually does support a lot of streaming data as well. So I have this slide that I took this table from a 2010 paper that did a comparative study between Gephi and some of the other tools, including iGraph. And I don't want to bore you with this table because it's actually pretty dated. But the only thing I want you to observe in this table is that the expected computing time, the fourth row in the red box. So Gephi is actually medium when it comes to computing time. Partly because of the language in which it's built. So if you're interested in maybe tens or hundreds of millions of nodes, Gephi is probably not your best choice. But anything in the range of 1,000 to 100,000 nodes, but if you're interested in visualizing and easy exporting, Gephi is probably going to be very handy for you. Okay, but that's sort of the where each of these tools position itself in terms of the market. All right, so enough talking. Let me switch over to the demo, but before I do that, let me pause for a few seconds for any final questions on the presentation. Okay, so if there are no other questions, let me stop the sharing for a second and get started on the Gephi. Now, I'm not very sure if you have Gephi installed on your system. So are there anyone over here with Gephi installed already? Are you going to follow along, or so do you have the data set, or should I just show you and then? Okay, so I know Mukund has it installed.
And just for your information, today also we just sent you the email for the link to the software and the sample data set. Maybe you can just, you can download that again. And if you want, we can even share the link here. Let me know if that helps.
Okay. So I see a couple of people over here have it installed already. For those of you who might not have installed it for whatever reasons, don't worry. I'm going to send you a step-by-step tutorial right after the session, so you can actually just follow along and replicate whatever I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes. So it's all right. You can just follow along. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So Dave's at the yeah. So you can follow me, and then later on you can replicate it. Okay. So Mukund says, I don't know what to do with it. However, yeah, if you knew what to do with it, you wouldn't be here. That's all right. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing for a few seconds. I'm going to come back in like 10 seconds. Okay. All right. So are you able to see my Gephi screen? So if you open Gephi, you should see a screen like this. Now I have 0.9.1 installed. So this is 0.9.1. So if you install the previous version, like 8.2, you might see a slightly different screen, but it should roughly be the same. Okay, so you can see the screen. Great. So, all right. So now let me just load the data. So you can go to File on the top left. You click Open, and then you see the netscience.gml dataset that I had shared with you. So this is actually, just to give you a little history about the data, this is the co-authorship network data that I spoke about earlier. So every node is an author, and then if there's a link between two nodes, it means that they have co-authored a paper. Okay, so when you click on the file and click Open, so Gephi will actually load the network, and it will give you a summary, so what's called an import report. And you see over here, you have to choose whether the network is undirected or mixed. And I'm going to choose undirected because it's an undirected network. And Gephi is automatically summarize the network for you. So it detects that there are 1,589 authors, nodes, and there have 2,742 edges between them. And it's not a dynamic graph, right? So you don't have a time varying network over time. And if you have no issues during the import process, if it's successful, you'll have no issues over here. If you have some errors during your import process, they will report the errors and warnings in the space over here. So if you click OK, you would see the network on the screen right over here. Okay, so far so good. Now, if you look at the window, let's just take a step back and just see all the different windows you have on your screen. Now take a look at, okay, I'm gonna share my screen so that you can see my cursor actually. All right, so are you able to see my cursor now? Okay, perfect. Okay, so if you look at the top left here, okay, hold on. If you look at the top left, it says appearance. So the appearance tab is useful for designing the nodes better, like ranking and partitioning. So this is a bit advanced stuff. I'm going to talk about it a bit later. But let's start with the context on the top right over here. So it basically summarizes your existing network, which you already saw in your import box window. And if you come straight to here on the bottom left, you see there's a layout tab. Now what the layout tab does is it basically helps you visualize the network better, because right now it's just a big block of black mass in the middle of the screen. There's you have no idea what's going on. So if you click the button here, it gives you a list of algorithms that you can apply on this giant mess in the middle of your screen to actually visualize your network better. So let me apply this algorithm, and it has a very complicated pronunciation. So I'm going to pronounce it as Fruchterman-Reingold. I always screw up on the pronunciation. So if you select that algorithm and you increase the speed from 1, so the speed over here, so you can see the definition below, right over here. It increases convergence speed when you increase the speed of the algorithm, but then you might end up with no convergence. So that's a loss of precision. So let me increase it from 1 to 10 so that it speeds up the process. And you click run. And then you watch the magic happen. Now, while this is happening, let me just give you a background into what these algorithms are. Most of these algorithms are what's called force-directed algorithms. So by force-directed algorithms, what it means is that they work in the way an electric field works. That's the best way to explain it. So you can think about these nodes having charges, having like charges, so they repel each other. And the edges are kind of spring embedded. So if you think about nodes, so any two nodes in the network, when you apply the algorithm, would repel each other. But then the edges, if the nodes are connected to each other, so they have an edge between them, you can think of the edge having a spring. So if the nodes try to pull apart, the edges will try to bring them together. So that's how the algorithm works. So over time, it gives you this very neat visualization. Now, if you want to center it to the middle of the screen, because some parts of your network might have gone outside the window, you can see there's this nice button right over here. It says center on graph, okay, to the bottom left. So if you click it, it actually centers your graph in the middle of the screen right over here. So now it's much clearer, right? It looks pretty beautiful actually, and you can already spot these clusters. So there's one over here. So there's one over here. There's a couple of clusters over here. But if you want to actually preview this network in a more accurate, in a bigger screen, you can go to the third tab. So we are still in the overview tab over here on the top left. But if you click on preview on the third tab on the top, it takes you to this screen. Okay, now you come to this screen. And if you click the refresh button on the bottom left, okay, let me see. All right, so let me actually stop the. If you see the screen on the bottom right, you'd see that the Fruchterman-Reingold algorithm is actually still running. Let me stop that. So I'll go back to the overview tab, and I'm going to stop this. Okay, so there's a little bit of bug here. So I can just stop it directly from here. There's a cross button on the bottom right, so I can cancel the process. Okay, now I can go back to the previous screen, and I can refresh it. But sometimes the graph might not appear, and that's probably because of issues with my graphics driver. Are some of you able to see the graph? If you refresh it on your screen, then I know that there is something wrong with my graphics driver. Okay, yeah, so Nessa says, yeah, I'm able to see the graph. Right, so it's depending on your graphics driver, I think sometimes you might not be able to see the screen. Okay, so what you can do is you can try changing the presets here on the top left to, okay, maybe a black background, and then try refreshing again. Yeah, sometimes it's, yeah, sometimes the preview graph doesn't work. But anyway, this is, so on this window, you can actually play around with the graph a little bit. So for example, you can try to click you can look at the section on node labels on the left-hand side, and it says show labels. So which means you can see the names of the labels on the nodes, right? So you can play around with the different settings over here to customize your graph to look differently. So for example, you can change the size of your nodes, you can change the size of your edges, you can change the color of your edges, etc. Now, if you want to actually take a look at the data on how it is stored inside Gephi, you can go to your data laboratory. So that's the second tab on the top. So you see that, so we are right now in the preview tab. If you click the data laboratory, it takes you to the actual data. Now, this is what the data laboratory looks like. So you have the data table tab open, okay? And you see there are two sub-tabs, one for nodes. So you click on the nodes, it tells you, it shows you all the different IDs and the corresponding labels. So in network terminology, a label is the name of a node. So yeah, every node has it's a string. It's how you refer to a node. And then you have edges, where you can see that you have a source and then you have a target. So this is your source node, this is your target node. The type of the edge is undirected, and you could have a weight. So you can have a weight over here. So the weight in this context means the number of papers they have co-authored. So the more the number of papers, the higher the weight. The stronger the weight, actually, I should say stronger, not higher. All right. So this is what the data table looks like. Now, if you see the bottom of this window, you can actually play around with the data table as well. So if you want to add a column by yourself, say for example, gender. If you can go to the node sub-tab, and you want to add a column that categorizes the gender of the authors, and you had the data from somewhere, you could actually add a column. All right, over here, you could say gender, and then you can. So I'm not going to do it now, but this is how you do it. Okay. All right, so let's get back to the overview screen. This is the net, and let me now show you how you can actually compute some centrality metrics inside Gephi. So if you look at the window on the bottom right, so you have a statistics tab, right next to filter. So you can see a lot of these network centrality measures already preloaded for you. All that you need to do is just click the run button next to it, right? So if you want to compute the average degree of the network, so the average degree of the network is the average of all the individual degrees, okay? So if you just click the run button, It takes maybe a few seconds, and then it gives you this really nice chart. And someone asked me a question about the long tail and the fat tail, right? So this gives you an idea of the tail. So the first graph, so it tells you that the average degree is 3.451, and it gives you a degree distribution chart. So on the y-axis, you have the degree, and the x-axis, you have the number of nodes. Sorry, it's the other way around. On the x-axis, you actually have the degree, and on the y-axis, you have the frequency. So how many nodes have that degree? So it gives you a sense of the frequency distribution. All right, so Mukund said, awesome. I'm glad you liked it. So you can actually compute some other measures as well. So you can think about network diameter. So what's really cool about Gephi, and I think I really appreciate this feature, is when you click the button next to network diameter, it actually tells you what network diameter is. So here, you read the definition. It says the diameter is the longest graph distance between any two nodes in the network. So that is how far apart are the two most distant nodes, right? So if your network is like really sparse, so diameter would be really large, right? Very long. So you just click OK. It computes the, okay, so it creates this graph distance report, and you see the diameter is 17, which means that if you, the farthest, the largest distance between two authors in the network is 17 in our network. And it also computes all these other neat centrality distributions for you as well. Okay. This is very cool, all right? Oops, I'm sorry. That's 17 hops. Yes, Erin. Yeah, that's 17 hops. That's correct. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to show you is about filters, and I think this is probably a more interesting thing. Now you have this whole mess, right? Now what if I'm not interested in the whole 1,589 set? I just want to know which is the most active cluster of social network researchers in this whole network. So basically what I'm asking in network terms, if you've done a little bit of graph theory, I want to know which is the single largest connected component in my network. So if you come here to filters, all that you have to do is click on attributes, and then you can look at, or actually you can click on topology, and you can click on this filter called giant component. And all that you have to do is just drag it to the query window just below it and just leave it there. And then once you click the giant component and there's a filter button, just click filter. All right. So it just gives me, so it filters out all the other nodes. So you click filter again, it gives you the whole network. All right, so you can toggle between the single largest connected component. And if you go back to the context window on the top over here, it tells you that the single largest connected component has 379 nodes, which is 23% of the whole network. So what does it tell you about the network? It tells you that 23% of the authors are all connected to each other through some link. They might not be directly connected to each other, but you can reach anyone, any node in this connected graph from any other node. All right. It's very cool. So you can play around with the different kinds of filters that you have, actually. If you're done with a particular filter, you can just delete it. So you can just do a right click and remove. So you get back to your original graph. All right. Okay, so I promised I'd show you, tell you about the appearance tab on the top left. The appearance tab, as the name suggests, is for you to better design your graph. So for example, if you want to have the size of the nodes proportional to their degree. So if you want to have some kind of ranking, right? So that larger nodes mean that they have more friends. So you could do that with this tab, essentially. So over here, you have two subtabs, nodes and edges. So you click on nodes, and you click on attribute subtab, and it tells you, it has a drop down which says choose your attribute. Now remember, this drop down will only have fields if you have actually computed those attributes in your statistics tab earlier, right? Remember the statistics tab on the right hand side? So if you have ran that particular statistic, it will show in your drop down over here. So since I have already computed all these metrics from my statistics tab, they're showing me all these options over here. So let me choose degree, and then it will give you the color scale. So you can choose a color scale from a list of different kinds of scales. So let me choose this one, okay? I like this one, okay? So what this tells you is it will change the color of your nodes based on their degree, such that the lowest degree will have white color and the highest degree nodes will have red color. And then you press apply, you see the color of the nodes in your network has changed. Now you see a lot of nodes will disappear because of the color scheme, right? Because I assigned a white color to the nodes. Let me change the color scheme here to something like this, something that doesn't have white in it. Okay, maybe this is fine. Let's try with this one. Okay, yeah. So you see there are some green patches in the middle, and then some pink ones, and then some white ones as well. So you can change the color over here. You can also change the size of the nodes. So if you see the sub tab over here, the 4 tabs, you can click the second tab, which is about size. And again, you can choose an attribute, degree, and it tells you to choose what the minimum and maximum size is. So maybe let me increase the maximum size to 10. So what I'm telling Gephi right now is assign a size of 1 to the node which has the minimum degree, and assign a maximum size of 10 to the node which has a maximum degree, and scale every node in the middle accordingly, according to this scale. Okay. So when you click apply, and you see a lot of edges become non-existent, like very hard to see because the size distribution has changed. So through this tab, you can actually change the color and size of your nodes and edges depending on some criteria that you might have. What's the purpose of this tab? Sometimes you might want to highlight specific parts of your graph more than others. So you could play around with the appearance tab to achieve that. Okay. All right. So I think I've actually showed you most of the bare bone structures in Gephi. The last and the most interesting part that I want to demo to you guys is, if you look at the menu, so over here, there's something called plugins. So if you go to the tools section and you click on plugins over here, it opens this plugin section, which are, so as I mentioned, right? Okay, so I have a chat question over here. So Mukundas, you could also change the appearance when we have filters. Yeah, so the filter is a structural feature. Filter will only add or remove nodes and edges. You cannot change color, for example, or you cannot change the size, like literal size of the nodes and edges. Filter is only for adding or removing nodes and edges. All right, perfect. So if you want to do more with Gephi, right, you have very specific functions. For example, if you have a spatial network, or you have a streaming database, you want to have data you want to connect Gephi to a streaming database, you need additional plugins for that, which you can download from the plugin section here. If you want to export this graph to a JavaScript file, if you want to export it to an HTML file, you can have a plugin for that as well. Okay. Now, I have installed one plugin from this list of plugins that I want to show you, and which is because it's really cool. But before that, let me open a new project. Okay, so I go to File over here, and I create a new project. I ask you, do you want to save your project? I say, no, I don't want to save my project. Okay, so now it creates a new project for you. Now, if you see over here, right next to the layout tab, I have a tab called Twitter Streaming Importer. And this is one of my favorite plugins. Now, as the name suggests, you can actually connect Gephi to a live Twitter feed, and you can actually plot hashtag networks, user networks in real time. Okay, it's actually very cool. If you click the Twitter Streaming Importer tool, it's a three-step process. It will first ask you to set credentials. So if you don't have credentials, you can create one. So you can go to apps.twitter.com and create your Twitter app. So you don't have to create an app. You just sign up for a app. You create your sample app, and it gives you a consumer key, a consumer secret, an access token access. You get these for information from your Twitter. I'm actually giving you my information right over here. Anyway, so once you have the credentials, you can, okay, let me just, you can then go to step 2. So you don't have a query file, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some words that I want to track on Twitter. Now, obviously, we have a lot of stuff that we can track right now, but there's one word that everyone's talking about, and let me go and see if I can track what people are talking about. Donald Trump, right? So I click Trump, and then I click the add button. So it adds Trump to my list. And let me actually also go and add Hillary, just to maintain balance. And so I have 2 words, Hillary and Trump. And I go to the 3rd section, where they ask you, what network logic do you want to apply? So Gephi wants to know, how do I construct the network? Okay, once I get all the tweets, what do I do with it? And I tell Gephi that, give me a hashtag network. What that means is, first get all the tweets that have Trump or Hillary mentions, and then give me a network of how the hashtags are connected to each other. So if 2 hashtags co-occur on the same tweet, you have a tie between them. If they don't, you don't have a tie between them, right? So that's how the network is constructed. And then when you click connect, okay, and then you just wait, you see nodes appearing on the screen in real time. And you can actually follow the numbers over here on the top right. You can see how many nodes and how many edges are actually, so this is happening on Twitter in real time, and you're plotting it on Gephi. Okay? And you can see different edge sizes, edge widths, depending on how many times these hashtags co-occur with each other. So you can see this graph is growing in real time. Now, what you could also do is you can go back to your overview tab, and you can apply a layout algorithm in real time as you're streaming this graph. All right, so this is your network. All right, so let me stop the Twitter stream. We have enough. Now what you can do is you can quickly go to your data laboratory to see what data you've got. Here you are. So you have the nodes. So remember, each node is a hashtag. So you have all these hashtags that occur on tweets that mention Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. The labels are the same. So timestamp right now, 22nd February. This is happening on Twitter right now. And the Twitter type is hashtag. If you go to the edges tab, it actually shows you how these hashtags co-occur with each other in each tweet. So you can actually get the data. If you want to export this data and do some more analytics in Python or R, you can actually export this table. There's an export table option right on top. And you can actually export it as a CSV file and then load it in whatever tool you want, right? So this is, again, a very, very good example of how Gephi offers very cool plugins to actually connect to social media streaming data. And you can plot it in real time. You can visualize it. You can compute all these network metrics in real time and export it, of course. All right. So that's pretty much it. So I think I've covered most of the interesting stuff in Gephi. I hope you found this tutorial to be of some use and some interest. And if you have any further questions, let me know. Yeah. All right. So I have a. Okay. So Ratan asks, what kind of analysis can I run? Okay, so if you look at the settings tab on the right, the statistics, you can actually see all the different kinds of network metrics that you can compute. You could also run some more advanced social network analysis, but you would have to install the plugins for that. Yeah, you can take a look at the list of plugins. There's some very cool network algorithms that you can run. Oh, what kind of analysis can I run in terms of business value? Can I give an example? Off the top of my head, well, that's an interesting question. You can do two things. First of all, I mean, once you have the network data, you can always export it as a network file, load it in R, in iGraph or Python, if you're using the iGraph library, and use it for regressions, use it for predictive models, etc. But that's using the network data in a different tool. On this tool, you can actually use some kind of spatial plugins. There are plugins that are specialized for spatial data that can actually let you see, for example, if you want to track GPS networks, you can actually see where your customers are moving in real time. So there's something that I always wanted to do just by using your tweets. So some tweets actually have longitudes and latitudes, depending on whether the geocode is mentioned in the tweet. You can, based on the tweets, you can visualize how your consumers are moving over a course of a day, and what kind of brand-related topics they're discussing about on social media. So there's a lot of locational analytics that you can directly do using plugins on Gephi. That's just one example. There's so many things you can do. Devdatta asks, can we load a new variable directly in the data lab Gephi, which is characteristic of the nodes, and use that to weigh nodes? Yes, you can. Yes, I think that's possible. Okay. So are there any other questions? Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the slide deck. You can also contact me on the Teach Edison platform, or on LinkedIn or Facebook, wherever. We can always catch up and discuss. I love talking about networks. I'd love hearing about new ideas, new suggestions. Always happy to chat. And once again, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Prashanta. I think thanks for your time. I understand it's very late for you back there, but really appreciate it. And for all of you here, probably you can write your questions to Prashanta. I think he's been very kind enough to kind of host free sessions. Maybe you can go to one-to-one mentoring site and post your questions, and based on his availability, he can probably answer you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.